This Restorative Justice Life is a production of Amplify RJ. Follow us on all social media platforms at Amplify RJ, sign up for our email list, and check out our website at amplifyrj.com to stay up to date on everything we have going on. Make sure you're subscribed to this feed on whatever platform you're listening on right now so you don't miss an episode. And finally, we'd love it if you left us a rating and review. It really helps us literally amplify this work. Thanks for listening. Enjoy the episode. Welcome to This Restorative Justice Life, the podcast that explores how the philosophy, practices, and values of restorative justice apply to our everyday lives. I'm your host, David Ryan Barcega Castro Harris, all 5 names for the ancestors, and I'm the founder of Amplify RJ. On this podcast, I talk with RJ practitioners, circle keepers, and others doing this work about how this way of being has impacted their lives. Kat, welcome to This Restorative Justice Life. Who are you?
I am a journalist, which feels still weird for me to say, but I'll say it, I am.
Who are you?
I am a reader.
Who are you?
I am an operations person. I work behind the scenes to make all of the things happen, and I like to stay behind the scenes.
Who are you?
I'm a cat owner, so if my cat comes and makes an appearance, you may see him.
Who are you?
I am someone who has worked in education for a while, in a bunch of different contexts, and I have a passion for it.
Who are you?
I am an only child.
And finally, who are you?
I am somebody who deeply believes in community and the power of community, and I feel like I am constantly searching for community.
Thank you so much, Kat, for sharing all that. We're going to get into the intersections of all those aspects of who you are right after this.
Hey folks, I'm Elise, your producer, and today we are welcoming Kat McKim to the podcast. Kat is a writer who also works in operations at a network of K-12 schools in New York City. She is also a journalist, restorative justice practitioner, and educator, as you will hear much more about in the upcoming episode. Without further ado, let's get back into it.
Thank you again so much for being here, Kat. It is always good to check in at the beginning of the conversation. So, to the extent that you want to answer the question, how are you?
How am I? Well, first, thank you so much for having me. I am excited to talk with you today. I'm really nervous too. I mean, I interview people all the time, and I am super nervous to be on the other side and be interviewed. So now I kind of understand both sides of the interview game. So that is one way that I am right now, is nervous. As somebody who is working in education right now, I'm fine. I'm making it. I think a lot of us maybe share those sentiments. I am doing okay, and I joke with my colleagues that doing okay is the new doing great. And so yeah, I think that's how I am.
Yeah. And I think that resonates with many people who are inside and outside of education spaces, going on almost 2 years of pandemic times. On top of everything else that life is throwing at us. I appreciate you being game to take on this other side. You said that you're a journalist. I won't call myself a journalist. I consider myself
totally are.
A conversationalist. And this is just media, right? I don't hold myself to high journalistic standards like that. But one of the reasons that I've got you on here is you talked about you wrote an article talking about how COVID is making it harder for schools to practice restorative justice, and COVID has made everything harder in schools, and life in general. But when we're talking about the relational work of restorative justice in what were previously socially distanced times, virtual times, and now still a little bit socially distanced, quote unquote, different sets of rules in place. COVID has made RJ practice difficult. We're going to get to the article in a bit, but I'm curious for you, how did you get your start with restorative justice?
Um, yeah, so I definitely think of myself in a lot of the work that I do, but definitely in journalism as kind of a generalist. And so I dabble in lots of different things. I have dabbled, I will say, in restorative justice in a few different contexts. So I was a teacher myself. I actually still teach. I teach adults, so I no longer teach kids. But so I was a teacher. I Most of my friends are teachers or work in education somehow. And so I feel like I get a feel for kind of what's going on in education. I've seen over the past few years schools moving toward away from really harsh zero tolerance type policies and trying to do something different. And so that was kind of in my consciousness as I started to think about this article. And I've actually done a series of articles now, like a few, one right after the other, that have been totally interrelated. And so I did one on student mental health coming back from the pandemic. I did this one about kind of shifts in school disciplinary policy. And then I've just done one on school community. And so I think my journey has kind of been like a blending of my experience in education and then the experience of so many people that I work with that I'm friends with. My husband is a teacher. And so certainly like his experience in hearing anecdotes directly from folks' classrooms. And I think in the course of, I didn't actually start this piece out specifically to talk about restorative justice. I was just curious about shifts in school discipline systems. And as I went through the interviews and the research that I did, it struck me that restorative justice is just so humane and makes so much sense. And I was applying what I was learning from research and from interviews to kind of my experience as a first and second and third year teacher and being like, wow, if I had been able to do this in my classroom, like that would have been phenomenal. And so, yeah, I don't know. That was a really circuitous way of answering your question. So hopefully something in there answered your question.
It gave me enough for a follow-up at least, right? When we think about restorative justice here within the context of Amplify RJ, the way that I define it is a philosophy, set of practices that is rooted in indigenous values of interconnection, right? So we're proactively building and maintaining relationships rooted in equity and trust. And when harm happens, we're repairing those relationships. If you had that toolkit, that framework when you were a first, second, third year teacher, like what would have been different?
I mean, I think that my students would have been a lot happier. And so, hey, if any of you from JZ George are out there listening, Miss McKim is saying right now, y'all would have been a lot happier if I had been a better teacher in a number of ways. So I think there's that. I think I would have been a lot saner and had a lot more serenity as a teacher. And I think I might have stayed in teaching, maybe longer, because I think the main reason that I left teaching was the classroom management aspect of it. I struggled a lot with that, and I started out teaching middle school, and I quickly decided middle school was not for me. I think it takes a very special teacher to teach middle school. My husband is a middle school teacher, so I feel like that's very impressive. I also taught kindergarten and first grade, and so I thought maybe younger kids would be a different experience. Ultimately, I left the classroom because I felt really stressed out by classroom management, and I felt like it wasn't something I could do well. And so when I hear that toolkit and I learned more about restorative justice in the course of reporting this story, I think that was definitely a thought I had, was like, maybe I would have been in this more for the long haul.
Yeah. What was it about this framework, that was like, oh, this would have been helpful for me?
Yeah, so one of the people that I talked to for the story, Alan, who is the principal from California, he said something during the interview that I was like, whoa, if I could have had that in my head as I was teaching, that would have been remarkable. He said, um, student misbehavior is kind of a given, like it's gonna happen. And so we can't live in this world where we think that there's not going to be conflict. Like conflict is going to happen. It's how we deal with the conflict and the tools that we have to deal with the conflict. Yeah, I mean, I think that just really struck me as, I mean, maybe like, I think that sounds really obvious now that I'm saying it, but it was something like in my head every day. I would go into my classroom and I would be like, okay, like, please no conflict, please no conflict. Like, can we, like, I just want to teach a perfect lesson so that like it goes perfectly and, there's like no conflict. Um, and just that, like, that's not reality. And this idea that if as a teacher, if I'm doing my job, like if I'm using this approach and I'm doing it well, that kids are building so many more tools to handle the conflict themselves. And so the idea that adults are kind of stepping back as this, like, oh, I've got to be, and I think certainly my first year of teaching, I was like, I'm pretty small. I'm like a small person, and I don't think I'm that imposing. And definitely as a first year teacher, I was like, oh man, I have to, like, I gotta be the authority in my classroom, which, like, I'm not that authoritative. So I think had I had this toolkit of like, it's not about the authority and it's not about the, like, as the adult, I'm right. But it's about this interconnected community and it's about, how we solve conflict together and like how we teach each other to manage that. I think that would have been pretty remarkable.
Yeah. I think a lot through the work of Amplify RJ, how much individual teachers having this set of tools, toys, this framework for this way of being in the classroom, like, can have such a great impact on the students that they're encountering. One of the other things that you talked about in the article is like, it's not enough for one teacher to know these things, right, and practice these things when they're when we zoom out to like a school level, and I think this was Derek, I want to get his name right, Derek Hinckley, who's an 8th grade history and English teacher in Chicago, was talking about how, he used to be at a school that talked about like, yeah, we do restorative practices, but like not everybody was like fully equipped. Not everybody had the same definitions of what that was. And so as important as, individuals having the practice is, like, communally having a practice and common language and definitions and practices for practices and strategies for how that goes is important. That's hard enough in non-COVID times, right? But what are the things that you've seen or heard as the additional struggles with COVID?
Yeah, I mean, I think that they are some of the struggles from non-COVID times, but hugely magnified. I think so. The first word that comes to my mind is just time. And I wrote a previous article about the choices that schools are having to make in terms of how they use time in the school day.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, and what I heard over and over from people in reporting this article was just like, it takes so much time. It takes more time than just saying like, oh, you did X thing, so you're going to have X consequence. I think that, like, the issue of time, like, post-COVID has just, I won't say post-COVID, I'll say post being online and doing online learning for a year and a half is just like, so schools are having to make such difficult choices and teachers are having to make such difficult choices about how to use time. And like, that's one resource that obviously, like, you're not getting more of it. So I think that that's one thing. And then I think related to time, like, there's so much on teachers' plates aside from teaching in their classroom, right? Like, so much related to the isolation and the struggles of the past I'm saying year and a half, and then I'm like, nope, it's been 2 years. Like, we're coming up on March, it's been 2 years. So yeah, the past 2 years, in the story I reported about student mental health, just the amount that teachers, like, you've got to kind of step out of your role as teacher and then step into, like, how am I supporting my students who are, like, when they're asked to write an essay, like, in some cases breaking down crying because they don't feel like they can persist in that task. Um, or how am I supporting kids that feel like just really like socially nervous and scared to be in person at school. And so I think that takes a toll on teachers. I mean, as I said as I researched for one of the previous articles, like surveys saying that teachers are so burnt out. A lot of them are considering leaving the profession. I think that, if the adults in the situation like are really hanging by a thread, then to be able to engage in this like deep relational communal practice, it seems from the people that I've talked to and what I've heard, just is like that much more difficult.
Yeah, and 100% this work takes time, and when there are competing priorities, right? First of all, like, teaching you algebra or being able to like
Yeah.
teach whatever content you're trying to teach, like, I don't know that is 100% the goal anymore, and like if it even should be.
Yeah.
And like that's not what teachers have been trained to do, right?
Yeah.
For the most part, right? There's so much education. There's so much that's a part of teacher education that is about your content and how to scaffold and how to differentiate, so other people, so students on different levels can, learn the material that you're trying to teach them. And I think teacher education has gotten better over the years at like what I'm going to call quote unquote social and emotional learning,
Mm-hmm.
right? Aspects of this. Restorative justice is for the most part not explicitly taught in teacher education across the country in the US. Sorry to our people who are listening in other countries, but now when we're asking teachers to take on this additional role while they themselves are in the midst of crisis because of the pandemic, like it's too much, and hence those rates of burnout. And I'm laughing in some ways because like here we are, two people who aren't working actively in schools but are in relationship, are witnessing the people who we love, we care about, who we know are super important to the development of society and the next generation, struggling to do all this. This is an unfair question to ask, but like, how do we fix it?
I think that recognition of the problem is one of the first steps. And so when I talked to school leaders for the article that I wrote about schools needing to make difficult choices about how to use their time, school leaders had talked about things that they were doing to try to take some of the burden off of teachers. And so, they said we are, normally we would, like before the pandemic, we would use, let's say, Wednesday afternoons to do professional development. But we've been letting teachers have that half day for themselves, so that they can take care of themselves, they can go to appointments. And then, I think that schools are also thinking creatively about like how to schedule teachers, schedule the workday and schedule the school day so that teachers are, so that the responsibilities are more balanced. And so I think the acknowledgement by school leaders, certainly, by kind of everybody. Parents had a front row seat into their kids' classroom, in a Zoom classroom, in a way that they never have before. And I think that, I hope that really underscored like the work that teachers do day in and day out, absolute dedication that they put into their classrooms. And so I feel like there's this just greater awareness of everything that teachers are asked to do. And then, I feel like speaking of awareness, there's also, when I reported on student mental health, such a huge groundswell of awareness there that like teachers are dealing with this because student mental health is in crisis. And I mean, there's also the influx of COVID relief funding that, as I talked about a little bit in this article, is like a hopeful thing because there's actually some money behind, there's a clear need, there's acknowledgement of the need, and now there's actually some resources that, if they are used in the way that they're intended, could actually, go to fund and are currently going to fund more support staff, more staff around mental health, and more people in the school that can take some of that burden off of teachers and off of administrators.
Yeah, definitely. When we talk about like the limits of time, right? That's not something that we necessarily get more of, right? You can't legally ask people to work beyond their contract hours. And then there's a whole nother thing about like teacher compensation that like we don't want to get into right now, but like teachers should be paid more.
Yeah.
But like the funding for additional resources is a huge piece, and everybody has different priorities. Like when we're also in the middle of like fighting battles around like quote unquote critical race theory, right? The bans on books, don't say gay legislation, right? I have a lot of sympathy and empathy for administrators and school leaders about like, where are we putting energy, where, we're still prioritizing like student outcomes, but like also like taking care of the staff who are making sure that like they're able to, one, like function as human beings, but then also like be their best for the students that we're trying to teach and care for. You've talked to people all across the country for this article and the other articles in this series. Like, what have you seen that has like worked well or worked?
Yeah, so one of the things that I've seen over and over is the power of school community. Wrote an article explicitly about student community and belonging, and I had the pleasure of talking with a couple of schools who do this work really well. One of them is in the article, so De La Salle Academy here in New York City, and then another one, Common Ground High School in New Haven, Connecticut. And both of them, although this wasn't the focus of the article, it came up. So both of them use restorative practices and have like their school day structured so as to facilitate that. But they also do that in the context of having this amazing, like interconnected student community where kids really feel like they belong to a community. So they feel like they belong to a community of their peers. They feel like a sense of belonging with the adults in the building. They feel a sense of ownership over their school. And that's something that I've heard, like when I talked with Alan, the principal in California, he talked about like kids being able to solve conflicts on their own, like kids kind of owning that conflict resolution process. And so I think that I've just been impressed by how often community is coming up as a factor here and as something that, and like, so I thought that something that was interesting, we were just talking about teachers and, like how they're doing. Thought something that was really interesting in one of the researchers I talked to about belonging was she found that a lot of teachers didn't really feel a sense of belonging at school. And that, that had a direct impact on obviously, on their work, on their relationships with their students. And that, when teachers felt more grounded in their school community and like more of a sense of belonging, obviously that had big positive impacts. And so the fact that like this, like nothing happens in a vacuum and it's in the context of this like really intentionally built community was striking to me.
Yeah. And we talk about it all the time. It's not just like the responsive things or the reactionary things, right? Having that community proactively built, intentionally, like, allows you to, one, easier navigate the conflict when it happens, and two, like, have something to restore back to instead of having to like create something new when there is conflict. We talk all the time about the barriers to connection, right? And like, so often it is the time, the resources. Was there anything else that stood out in your reporting and your conversations that like people were really struggling with in order to like get to this place where they can, I'll say, like, quote unquote, be their best restorative selves?
Mm. I think that having like I'm kind of thinking of the whole like cup filling image here, and the fact that like people's cups, like when I'm talking to people, like people's cups are, if they aren't full themselves, then like they don't have that overflow to give to others. And I think that, when I talked with Chris, the education consultant in Kentucky, who like had kind of this view across multiple schools and multiple districts, um, he's saying like, hey, office referrals in some schools are like spiking hugely because teachers are feeling like they just can't, like they don't have it in them to like be able to do it in the classroom, to be able to work out the conflict in the classroom. And I mean, I think that comes from like obviously all of the factors that we were talking about before. And I think that there's the COVID relief funding, which is really hopeful. And one of the sources that I spoke to in the article, Liz King, she talked about like this kind of being in obviously in the context of a broader system and like broader system of educational inequality. Um, and like she talked a lot about how we can talk all we want about policy changes, or we can talk all we want about like this sounds like a great idea, or we can say like, hey, like let's implement this. This sounds great. Like let's do it as a school. But if there's not like the resources to back it up, that it just doesn't work. And I think that like that mirrors my own experience in education, where there's so many great ideas and like so many things that you want to implement, and if there's not the accompanying like actual way to make it happen, so whether that's like time, money, staffing, if that's not there, then it's not going to happen. And Liz brought up, that we have made intentional policy decisions where we are concentrating a lot of times kids who need the most support into schools that get the least resources. And I think that that's like, there it is. She said it, like actually her quote was more beautiful than the way that I just said it. But she said like, hey, that's a really hard, like schools can be a really hard place to be a kid, and they can be a really hard place to work. And so I think that kind of gets at the heart of it.
Yeah, and I think like just speaking to those disparities of where like those resources go, and like in sometimes in many cases like just like the geographic locations, right, schools being funded by property taxes, like where they're like impacting black and brown students the most. In like I know you talk to a lot of people across different parts of the country. I'm imagining I already know the answer to the question, so I don't want to put words in your mouth about like, the disparities are just increasing continually, right? But what patterns have you been able to identify or recognize, if any, around like the disparities between discipline with black and brown indigenous students, between that and white students?
So when I spoke with one of my sources for the article, Aaron, I thought that he made a really interesting point about uh, just this link that he was finding. I think his research at the time we talked was not yet complete, but he was finding this link between um, just the number of desegregation related court cases that had been undertaken against a given school district, suspensions, and particularly suspensions of Black students currently today within that school district. And so, I mean, I think that speaks to just like, and I mean, everybody I spoke with basically said the same thing, which is obviously the shift to zero tolerance, the shift to more reliance on suspension and those really harsh measures in the 90s and early 2000s disproportionately affected communities of color. And not only is it about the students who were getting suspended or who were directly being subjected to those harsh disciplinary measures, because I mean that in and of itself is terrible for those students to have to be subjected to that. But also, it has this impact on the entire school community, in that if you have higher rates of suspension in the school, that everybody fares worse on standardized tests. And so even kids who have not been suspended, even kids who have not really been subjected to those harsh disciplinary measures are still faring worse because of them. So I thought that was interesting too.
It's really just about the interconnection between all of these different issues and the intersection, and how even if you are not a Black student at that school, that's still having a negative impact on you. And so bringing it back to that critical race theory, like that bullshit conversation where it's we're making people feel guilty. It's no, we're trying to improve your life too. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, if we don't learn from that history, we're doomed to repeat the same mistakes. Is there anything else that you want to share about what you learned in this article or in this series that you're doing about schools in this time of COVID?
Educators are doing incredible work. Everyone in schools is doing incredible work. And I think I'm constantly struck by, so from my experience in education and also from people that I've talked to, there can be this feeling of okay, let's try this new thing. And okay, we tried it. Oh, it doesn't seem like it worked. Okay, let's try this other thing. Okay. Oh, we tried it and it's not really working. Which I mean I feel is understandable, and I am in no way faulting folks for having new ideas, for trying new things in schools. I think innovation makes a ton of sense. But in talking to people about what works, I am so struck by just the power of sticking with something over the long term. And I also am impressed by just how hard that is. So this last article I wrote, where I got to spend a bunch of time talking to a lot of people directly in the two schools that I spoke with, I just heard over and over, this is really hard. And I think maybe that sounds obvious when I say it, but from my experience, in how people have reacted to me when I've been a teacher and when I've worked in schools, and sometimes how people have reacted to my husband as a teacher. I mean, I hope this is not the case to my point earlier about I think there is a growing awareness of how difficult it is to run a school, how difficult it is to be a teacher. But I think there can maybe be this sense of oh, well, I mean, you just got kids in classrooms, how hard can it be? And I think, I hear, and my own personal experience and what I hear from others is doing things that work with consistency. It's not one magic bullet. It's like all these tiny little things that you kind of have to do every single day, and you have to do them like when it feels like nice and fun to do them, and you also have to do them when it feels like really hard to do them, and like you kind of just want to go home. And so yeah, I think I was just impressed by the importance of consistency and by just like how very hard it is, because I think that teachers, school administrators, like everyone working in schools, a lot of times I think they make it look easy. And I think talking to them in all of the reporting I've done, it's like, nope, they are just like paddling like hell under the surface to make this happen. And I mean, I think that that's really remarkable.
The reason why I don't like identify as a journalist, right, is because everything that happens on this podcast, I'm going to spin to the like, yeah, and with restorative justice. So like, it's like the propaganda machine for restorative justice, because like there's not enough content about that out there. But like what you're saying makes so much sense. Like, earlier I referenced like restorative justice as like frameworks and tools. But like when you're talking about like this long-term commitment to not like, I'm framing it in terms of restorative justice, but really just like education and caring for students, caring for young people, like this is long-term consistent work that takes a lot out of you as an individual. And a constant reminder to myself, I talked about it on last week's episode with Fabrice, like about like his militant dedication to his self-care so he can be his best for his community, and others, so he can do this work long term, so we can not burn out. So all these things, right, like is so important, because like this isn't an overnight process. This isn't like, hey, learn these tools, learn these skills. Yeah. This is, hey, here's this framework, and we're going to practice, and we're going to mess it up, and we're going to learn, and we're going to move forward. Like, and just because like it's not working immediately in this moment, things haven't transformed overnight, doesn't mean that like these still aren't worthy ways of trying to be together, right? Because as you said, so much about what have kept people going is that sense of community, that sense of belonging. And so the more that we can do that, the better. This podcast is brought to you in part by a generous grant from the National Association of Community and Restorative Justice. NACRJ promotes effective forms of justice that are equitable, sustainable, and socially constructive by providing a professional association for educators, practitioners, and others interested in restorative and community justice. The primary means to fulfill this mission are their membership-accessible website and biannual conference. This year, the conference is July 7 through 9 in Chicago. As a two-time conference attendee and a former Chicago resident, I'm super excited to be joining the conference this year to connect with RJ practitioners all across the world. You can save over $100 on conference registration by signing up with Amplify RJ's group registration at the link in the show notes. You can learn more about NACRJ and membership at nacrj.org. I want to transition to the questions that everybody answers on this podcast, and like not being like a long practitioner of restorative justice. Don't feel any kind of pressure to answer with any kind of expertise. Just looking to hear from you and your perspectives, in your own words, define restorative justice. Or if it's more helpful to frame the question this way, what does restorative justice mean to you?
Yeah. So I am ready for these questions. I'm an operations person, so I have prepared. Okay, so I think that it is a more humane way of relating to one another. When I interview people and I hear them talk about it, I just kept thinking to myself, like, that makes so much sense. And I think it is a way of relating to one another that gets out of this like victor, vanquished, like I'm right, I'm the authority figure, like we've got to be in this conflict, like this sense of like anger and of like being wronged, or like being of like this like victim perpetrator kind of mentality. And yeah, I thought that was beautiful in talking to people about it.
Absolutely. You get to sit in circle with 4 people, living or dead. Who are they, and what is the one question that you ask that circle?
Yeah. Okay, so they're all going to be writers. Maybe not a surprise there. But I guess I would say, so Gia Tolentino, Malcolm Gladwell, Ta-Nehisi Coates, and Joan Didion. And my question is, because they're all writers, so how do you take the like mass or mess of ideas that's kind of like swirling around in your head, and like all of these thoughts, and how do you turn that into something that says something beautiful about the world? Because I think that all of those people that I just named have like a phenomenal ability to do that. And so how do you how do you take it and like put it all together and make it shine so that it's, a cohesive story?
I don't know if you listened to any of the previous podcasts, but now I flip that question back to you.
Oh,
How do you take all of these ideas that you've talked to so many people across like how do you do that? How do you turn it around? How do you make it shine? How
uh,
do you make it beautiful?
oh my gosh. Um, well, so I've discovered that I've got to do it while sitting at my kitchen table. So I'm sitting at my desk right now, but like there's a distinction. Kitchen table is where I write. Um, and I think that I don't have a super defined process for it. I think I have all these notes, and like that's something that's really hard. Like I have all these notes and all these people that I talk to, and like all of these beautiful stories that come out of these conversations, and I want to put every single one of them into the article that I'm writing. Um, but I think when I feel like when I can't, I'm like, oh man, like I want to get that person's voice in there and I can't. Um, I think that one of the ways I do it is I like write out longhand. So I take a piece of paper and I take a pen and I like actually write like here's the first like paragraph that I'm gonna write. I don't write the whole thing longhand. That'd be a lot. But I write out like here's like the main crux of the story. And then I just start writing like things that stood out to me from my conversations with people. And then I take those very messy sheets of paper and I try to turn them into something.
Nice. Yeah, that's as in one version of my future life that may or may not happen. There's writing to come, so I'm gonna keep those things in mind.
Yes, I love it.
Um, I framed this question a little bit differently, probably in the questions I sent to you before. And it's to ask. It was asking you about like an oh shit moment, like a time that like you messed up, a mistake that you made, and like what you've learned from it. Specifically around restorative justice is typically how we frame it, but I want to zoom out a little bit and think about this restorative justice life. So like not just about like hey school discipline, like when you think about the way that you've navigated relationships and now with this lens in mind, like what's a moment where you're like, oh man, I wish I had known about restorative ways of being at this point in time.
Yeah. Well, so I guess the very first thing that came to my mind actually is super just restorative justice related. And I think it would be my first year teaching with my students. I raised my voice a lot. I got like really, really frustrated and really, really flustered. Um, and I, and like miraculously, my students had to show up to my class, right? Like it was seventh grade ELA. You can't opt out of that. So, you know, so sorry, y'all, you were stuck with me. But I think miraculously, like they showed up and they showed up with a kind of amazing generosity of spirit. I taught them in seventh grade and eighth grade, and then I have like stayed in touch. I had stayed in touch with a number of them on Facebook. And then I had like a video call with them when they were in ninth grade. And one of my like friends and colleagues was teaching them. Um, and like they were just so like warm and lovely to me. And I was like, y'all, like don't deserve, like I was not the best teacher for y'all. I tried, but like I was not the best. And the fact that they like showed up and you know, and like it felt like I have so many loving memories with them is a testament to them. But I think like that is, does it count as an oh shit moment if I say it's like my entire first and second year of teaching? Maybe.
Sure, I guess like, but then what is the specific thing that like you would do differently?
What would I do differently? Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that I've learned a lot, and this is not just from my reporting, this is like in life, but I think it relates to what we're talking about. I think I've learned so much in the intervening years about like stuff that I do and don't have control over, and like how to kind of bring more serenity into my relationships with people. And so I think that I would like what I would have done differently um, is just like recognizing my emotions as a teacher, like recognizing my triggers, recognizing like when I was getting frustrated about something, and then like putting into practice strategies for myself to be like, this isn't personal. This isn't like about you. Like you don't actually control what kids are going to, well, we could go down a rabbit hole with that, but like you don't actually control ultimately what kids are going to do in class. Um, and it's like your job to react in a way that's positive and react in a way that's like builds relationship and like builds community, instead of taking things personally and kind of freaking out.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think like grace for your 22, 23-year-old fresh out of college doing this teacher work self, like, in the intervening years, right? Like there's a lot of growth we do as humans, but to all the teachers out there and all the young people who are going into the teaching profession, right? Take those lessons to heart. What is like kind of along those lines, what's a mantra or affirmation you want everybody listening to this podcast to know?
Oh, I love mantras. I have a number of them written right here on post-it notes, like next to my computer. Um, so I would say one is one that I actually could have really used in my first year of teaching, and it's the acronym PAUSE, and it stands for uh, postpone action until serenity emerges. And I think if I had been able to do that, and to like not immediately leap into my feelings or leap into feelings of frustration and then take action based on those feelings of frustration, that would have been a game changer. And then another one I really like is go where it's warm. So this idea of like going where you're celebrated, and not where you're like either uh, excluded actively or where you're like barely or merely tolerated.
Dang, I was like, well, come on out to California, get away from that New York winter.
That too. That'd be
No,
great.
yeah. But to your point about pausing, right? Like there is such an immense amount of urgency around solving these problems, and we can't go about solving them in an urgent way,
Yeah.
right? That leads to burnout, that leads to devaluing people, that leads to more harm in relationships. So thank you for those two things. Who's one person I should have on the podcast? And you have to hook it up.
Yeah. So I would say I'm happy to facilitate this. The student that I spoke with for the piece that I wrote, her name was Tamar. And I loved talking with her because she is doing what sounds like some incredible work, as I think it's called she's a youth trainer, with Students and Educators for Equity, which is an organization here in New York City that works across a bunch of different schools to train. I think they do a lot of different things, so I don't want to misrepresent what they do, but I know that part of it seems to be training teachers and students in restorative practices, and just like relational practices. And so she helped obviously roll this out at her own school, but then she also trains people across the city and like works with an adult mentor, but like trains teachers and trains adults, and just like has a wealth of knowledge. And so, yes, I would be happy to put you in touch with her if you'd like.
Hey, looking forward to
Yeah.
it. Love to have the voices of young folks here on the show. And finally, how and where can people support you, your work, in the ways that you want to be supported?
Yeah. So I think just reading the articles that I've written, specifically over the past few months, and this kind of like series of interconnected articles. I mean, I wrote one about, this was a while back actually, and it's not so related, but I wrote one about how the financial literacy gap is not real. So this idea that like, oh, if we just like under-resourced communities are under-resourced because like people don't know about financial literacy, and if they just knew how to manage money better, like the problem solved. And it turns out that like from actual data, there's not a content knowledge gap there. So like to be clear, like folks are adults, kids alike, not great when it comes to financial literacy. So like we have low levels overall, but like there's not a gap based on income. There's not a gap based on race. So like that's totally a myth. So I wrote about that. And, obviously wrote about student mental health, wrote about student community and belonging in schools. And so just check out those pieces.
Beautiful. Is Fortune the go-to place for all of those articles?
Yes, it is.
Beautiful. Then we'll have that linked with all of your articles in the show notes. Thank you so much, Kat, for your time, your stories, and for amplifying other stories, for amplifying restorative justice, right? Like that's literally what this whole platform is about. And so when I see these stories out in the world, just like, yes, more people know, more people are getting like correct knowledge. And so really, truly, thank you so much for continuing to do the work that you do.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. This has been great.
Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in this week to This Restorative Justice Life. We'll be back with another wonderful conversation next week. Until then, take care.
Thank you so much, Kat, for all that you had to offer this episode. I really appreciated when Kat brought up the role of adults and how they contribute to a classroom environment and cultivating a sense of belonging within that classroom environment. Kat noted that adults sometimes use intimidation tactics, even unintentionally, in pursuit of control of a classroom because it can be hard to control a group of kids. However, what we must ask is, how else can we find control? Can we find control within ourselves? And can we find a common ground through relationship building in order to create a community control and community accountability instead of having to use a hierarchical structure that is more intimidating? One of the really important points that Kat also brought up was the point of belonging. One thing that I've noticed in my own life is that if you walk in there and you belong within yourself, if you are confident within yourself, then you can belong in a space. But without that confidence, without that self-assurance, it's hard to feel like you belong anywhere. So what we can do is cultivate a sense of belonging, which helps people get their own self-confidence in order to make them feel like they belong everywhere that they want to be. Well, that's all for now, folks. So thank you so much for listening, and make sure to check out the show notes below to hear more from Kat and to hear all of the things that she is talking about and more in all of her journalism pieces. As always, thank you so much, and I'll hear you next week.
Like what you heard? Please subscribe, rate, review, and share this podcast on whatever platform you're using right now. Or if you're old school, tell a friend. It really helps us further amplify this work. You can also support us by following us on our social platforms, signing up for our email list, signing up for a community gathering, workshop, or course. So many options. Links to everything in the show notes, or on our website, amplifyrj.com. Thanks so much for listening. We'll talk to you next week.